Imagine ruling half the world, yet needing servants to chop your breakfast into toddler-sized bites because your jaw is so deformed you can't chew bread. That was Charles II of Spain, the king who owned the silver mines of Peru, the golden halls of Vienna, and the bustling ports of Naples, but who drooled food back onto his golden plate, powerless over his own body. And here's the viral truth that history books barely whisper: this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a disease. It was a 300-year genetic time bomb built by the most powerful royal dynasty on Earth, a royal family so obsessed with pure bloodlines that they married their cousins for centuries until their DNA turned toxic. This is the true story of how royal incest and the pursuit of dynasty transformed Europe's mightiest rulers into a dynasty of genetic disasters. Welcome to the Habsburg Curse, the darkest royal family secret ever documented, and the ultimate proof that inbreeding always comes with a price. Picture Madrid in 1700 inside the Grand Royal Alcazar. Golden plates gleam under candlelight silk napkins, folded beside platters of roasted quail, brought from every corner of an empire where the sun never set. And at the center sits Charles II, 39 years old, a ruler of half the world, yet unable to speak clearly because his tongue is too large for his mouth. His lower jaw jutting so far forward that food tumbles back onto his plate as courtiers look away in shame. Foreign ambassadors would return home in horror, writing that the King of Spain looked more like a gargoyle than a monarch unable to manage basic human functions. But how did this happen? How did a royal bloodline that once produced Charles V, the emperor who conquered the Aztecs, shaped the Holy Roman Empire and spoke 6 languages, fluently collapse into a line of kings who couldn't even pronounce their own names? The answer lies in a royal obsession that spanned 16 generations, a genetic experiment fueled by power paranoia and royal secrets so devastating they'd shatter the myth of blue blood forever. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a viral blueprint of how DNA royal family secrets and the silent terror of inbreeding reshaped the destiny of Europe. Welcome to the story that proves one brutal truth: DNA always keeps score. Long before Charles II was choking on his own saliva, a brilliant young ruler believed he'd discovered the ultimate weapon for conquering Europe, and it wasn't swords, cannons, or armies. It was wedding rings. His name was Maximilian I, a king who looked at the map of Europe and saw not battlefields, but a chessboard of royal marriages. And that one-idea marriage as a weapon would unleash a 3-century genetic chain reaction that nobody could stop. Let's rewind to Austria in the late 1400s. Picture snow-capped mountains, tiny principalities fighting over scraps of land, and a fragile Habsburg kingdom squeezed between a hungry France to the west, the expanding Ottoman Empire to the east, and German princes ready to pounce from every direction. Most rulers would have chosen war, raised armies, spilled blood, bankrupted their treasuries in endless battles. But Maximilian wasn't most rulers. He believed marriage was cheaper than war and far more lethal. Why sacrifice thousands of soldiers storming city walls when you could inherit entire kingdoms with a single wedding contract? Why spend fortunes on siege engines when a royal engagement could open gates without firing a single shot? He was the original architect of a royal family strategy that would eventually mutate into the Habsburg Curse. And in that moment, Maximilian rewrote the rules of European power. This wasn't just politics. It was genetic warfare waged silently across generations. His motto was simple yet sinister: let others wage war. You happy Austria, marry. And it worked brilliantly at first. He married his son, Philip the Handsome, to Joanna of Castile, instantly giving the Habsburgs a claim to Spain. Then he arranged his grandson Charles to marry Isabella of Portugal, snapping up Portuguese trade routes and cementing control over the Iberian Peninsula. Each royal wedding added new lands, gold, and influence without spilling a single drop of blood. Other European royals were awestruck. They started copying the Habsburg playbook. Suddenly, the entire European nobility looked like one giant, tangled family reunion, where cousins married cousins and second cousins were practically strangers. It seemed perfect, a brilliant solution. Royal incest hidden behind veils and crowns. But hidden beneath the silk and jewels, the Habsburg family tree was transforming into something dangerous, a ladder climbing straight upward instead of branching outward. The gene pool was shrinking generation after generation, and nobody noticed the trap they were building until it was far too late. Because genetics always keeps score. It never forgets. And each cousin marriage was compounding silent mutations like interest on a lethal debt. By the 1500s, finding a royal spouse often meant scouring your own family tree, trying to pick a cousin close enough to secure power, but not so close that your future children might be born monsters. But how do you strike that balance when your entire bloodline is already intertwined like ivy around a stone wall? The Habsburgs didn't just gamble with territory, they gambled with DNA. And for a brief shining moment, it looked like Maximilian's insane strategy had produced a golden dynasty, the ultimate royal jackpot. His grandson, Charles V, would inherit more territory than any human being in history, a young emperor who seemed to prove the family marriage strategy was genius. But what nobody could see yet was that even Charles carried the first hairline cracks of the genetic time bomb. And that's the twist that turns this story from royal triumph into the darkest European royal scandal ever documented, because the very strategy that built an empire would slowly poison its own kings and queens. And to understand how those first genetic cracks became an unstoppable avalanche, we have to meet a young emperor who looked like a god on a throne, yet carried the seeds of the family's destruction in his jawline and his blood. Imagine inheriting half the known world before you're even old enough to legally drink. That was Charles V, the golden boy of the Habsburg dynasty, the ultimate royal jackpot that made Maximilian. I believe his marriage strategy was pure genius. Born in 1500, Charles wasn't just a royal heir. He was a walking empire. At 16, he was handed a global portfolio that would make today's billionaires look like kids running lemonade stands. Spain and all its New World territories, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, Burgundy, parts of Italy, trade routes spanning 3 continents, and rivers of silver pouring in from the mines of Peru. If you could teleport Charles V into the 21st century, he'd eclipse the net worth of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk combined, and that's not an exaggeration. But here's where the viral twist kicks in. Charles V wasn't just rich. He was capable, intelligent, a political and military prodigy. He spoke 6 languages, fluently negotiated peace treaties that shaped the fate of Europe, led armies that toppled the Aztec Empire, and reformed the entire legal structure of the Holy Roman Empire. Contemporary accounts painted him as the perfect Renaissance monarch, the model ruler who embodied royal power, divine authority, and ruthless intelligence. He was tall, commanding, with a strong jawline that artists like Titian immortalized in portraits meant to project strength and nobility. And for one shining moment, it looked like the Habsburg genetic experiment had birthed a god among men. But look closer at those royal portraits. Look beyond the velvet capes and jeweled armor. Because even in Charles V, the first cracks of genetic disaster were already beginning to show. It was subtle at first, a slight protrusion of the lower jaw, a certain tension in the facial muscles, something court chroniclers simply called the family look. Nothing alarming. Nothing that stopped Charles from ruling an empire. But those minor signs were more than family resemblance. They were the first whispers of a genetic time bomb ticking beneath the Habsburg throne. Medical records, often disguised as routine court documents, hinted at troubling patterns higher than normal infant mortality children who struggled with breathing issues, speech delays that lingered longer than in healthy, noble families. Yet no one dared connect the dots. After all, infant mortality was brutal in the 16th century. And besides, Charles seemed robust enough to keep the dynasty unstoppable. He ruled for 40 years, then did something unprecedented. For a monarch, he voluntarily retired in 1556, worn out from the impossible burden of managing half the planet without modern technology. He divided his territories between his son Philip II and his brother Ferdinand, then retreated into a monastery to spend his final years in prayer and contemplation, convinced he'd left his heirs the greatest inheritance in human history, and by every measure available at the time he had. Philip II inherited the Spanish Empire at its absolute zenith, with ships bringing back unimaginable wealth, armies feared across Europe, and royal influence stretching from Manila to Mexico. The Habsburg genetic experiment seemed bulletproof, the perfect royal family recipe for eternal power. But here's the cruel truth that DNA never lets you escape genetics, doesn't play by the rules of politics. While Charles V passed his crowns to the next generation, he was unknowingly passing along a silent, lethal inheritance written in his own blood. A hidden royal secret that would keep compounding generation after generation until it exploded in the body of a king who couldn't eat, couldn't speak, and couldn't father an heir. And to understand how the seeds of that disaster finally blossomed into the greatest genetic scandal in European history, we have to meet a queen whose love turned into a madness so dark she carried her dead husband's corpse across Spain. Before Charles II was drooling into golden plates, and even before Charles V rose as the golden boy of Europe, the Habsburg Curse was already whispering its first warning through the veins and mind of a woman history would call Joanna the Mad. And her story is one of the darkest royal family secrets ever documented, a royal scandal so twisted it reads like the plot of a psychological horror movie. On paper, Joanna of Castile was everything a Renaissance princess was supposed to be: intelligent, beautiful, fluent in multiple languages, and born to rule one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, were the same monarchs who expelled the Moors from Spain and bankrolled Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. The world lay at Joanna's feet. But deep inside, there was something different about how Joanna felt emotions. Where others experienced love, she experienced obsession. Where others felt grief, she fell into a bottomless abyss. And that difference would tear apart both her mind and the Habsburg dynasty. Joanna's marriage to Philip the Handsome should have been another political triumph for the family. He was stunningly attractive, charismatic, and a perfect chess piece in Maximilian Thurm's grand marriage strategy. Joanna was utterly dangerously in love from the moment she saw him. But Philip wasn't exactly the romantic type. He treated the marriage as a transaction, flaunted his affairs in public, and disappeared from court for months at a time. Most royal wives of the era might have endured the humiliation in silence, not Joanna. When Philip stayed away, Joanna paced palace corridors for hours, refused food, screamed in fits of rage that terrified her servants. Her jealousy became legendary. In one notorious incident, she attacked one of Philip's mistresses with a pair of scissors and hacked off the woman's hair in a frenzied act of royal vengeance. Court physicians called it melancholy. Modern psychiatrists might call it severe anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or bipolar disorder. But in the year 1506, mental illness was either divine punishment or evidence of demonic possession. Then tragedy struck like a lightning bolt from the Spanish sky. Philip the Handsome dropped dead at just 28 years old. And Joanna's love transformed into something far darker. She refused to bury him. Instead, she ordered Philip's body embalmed and sealed in a silver coffin. And then began one of the most macabre journeys in royal history. Imagine a royal caravan winding through Spain by moonlight. Joanna dressed head to toe in black mourning garb, traveling only at night because she believed a widow should never be seen by other men. And inside that coffin, the slowly decomposing corpse of the man she refused to let go. At every stop, churches, monasteries, lonely roadside chapels, Joanna ordered the coffin opened. She kissed Philip's rotting face, spoke to him as if he could hear her, smoothed his decaying hair, arranged his funeral garments over and over. Servants watched in terror as their queen's grief spiraled into a reality they couldn't comprehend. Months turned into years of this gruesome pilgrimage. Joanna wandered Spain like a royal specter consumed by love that had mutated into madness. Her father, Ferdinand, saw his chance. If Joanna was mad, she couldn't rule Castile. So he spread rumors through European courts that his daughter was possessed, unstable, dangerous to the realm. In 1509, Ferdinand confined Joanna to the royal convent at Tordesillas. She was 30 years old, and she would spend the next 46 years locked away in darkness, increasingly tormented by her own mind. The official story was that Joanna was hopelessly insane, but modern historians believe she wasn't born mad. She was born genetically vulnerable. The intense emotional storms, the uncontrollable obsessions, the inability to cope with betrayal or grief. All these might have been early symptoms of the same genetic flaws that would eventually doom the entire Habsburg bloodline. Joanna wasn't just a queen lost to madness. She was the canary in the coal mine for a dynasty whose royal blood was quietly turning into poison. And to see how those genetic warnings would transform from whispers into full-blown catastrophe, we have to look at what happened when the Habsburgs kept gambling on cousin marriages and produced a princess whose childhood portrait would reveal far more than any royal wanted the world to see. Before Charles II became the ultimate symbol of royal inbreeding gone catastrophically wrong, the cracks in the Habsburg dynasty's DNA were already becoming impossible to ignore, and nowhere was that truth more haunting than in the delicate figure of a little girl named Margaret Theresa. Picture the royal palace of Madrid in 1651, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, velvet curtains drawn back to reveal marble floors, courtiers bowing low as a 5-year-old princess is gently positioned in front of a towering canvas. Diego Velazquez, the master painter of the Spanish court, adjusts her silk dress, arranges her tiny hands, and studies her face through the eyes of an artist, and perhaps unknowingly through the eyes of a genetic witness. Because even as Velazquez captured her royal beauty for eternity, he also immortalized something else subtle but chilling signs that the Habsburg bloodline was turning toxic. Look closely at his masterpiece Las Meninas. See the little princess standing like a porcelain doll in the center of the canvas. She's beautiful, radiant. But there's a slight tilt to her head, as if breathing requires conscious effort. There's a subtle protrusion in her lower lip, the early shadow of the infamous Habsburg jaw. And behind those wide eyes glitters a distant, vacant look that suggests something deeper is misfiring beneath her perfect curls. Margaret Theresa wasn't just posing for a portrait. She was unknowingly serving as living evidence that centuries of royal incest were beginning to write their consequences on the bodies and futures of royal children. At only 5 years old, Margaret was already promised in marriage to her own uncle Leopold I's Holy Roman Emperor. In the Habsburg world, blood purity mattered more than biology. Cousin marriages were no longer merely political, they were genetic obligations. And every marriage tightened the noose around the family's DNA a little more. At first, Margaret's life seemed gilded with royal splendor. Her face graced paintings sent to royal courts across Europe propaganda to reassure the world that the Habsburg dynasty remained powerful and healthy. But the truth was far darker. Each year brought more worrying signs, breathing difficulties, fatigue, a fragility in her posture that Velazquez hinted at in his art, but dared not paint too explicitly. And then came the true test of a royal princess's worth marriage and childbirth, and at just 15, Margaret Theresa traveled to Vienna to marry her uncle. The wedding was hailed as a masterstroke of diplomacy, a glorious reunion of two Habsburg branches meant to secure the dynasty's future. But the young bride's body was already paying the price of her royal blood. Her first child survived only a few months. Miscarriages followed. When another child was finally born, the signs of Habsburg genetic damage were even more pronounced. The jaw deformity that had been subtle in Margaret became severe in her offspring, as if the genetic deck was now stacked entirely with losing cards. Imperial court physicians documented everything with obsessive detail. The Empress's difficulty speaking her labored breathing, her pregnancies that left her increasingly frail, her inability to regain strength between childbirths. But they never connected the dots between these royal ailments and the relentless cousin marriages that had defined the Habsburg dynasty for centuries. Margaret Theresa died in 1673 at only 21 years old. 6 years of marriage, multiple pregnancies, and a body that finally surrendered under the weight of genetic defects she never chose. The empire mourned her passing, but not for the right reasons. Diplomats wept over the loss of a potential source of heirs, not over the tragic waste of a young woman's life consumed by the silent tyranny of DNA. And while Margaret's story is heartbreak enough on its own, the real horror is that she wasn't an isolated case. Because back in Madrid, behind the palace's gilded doors, an entire generation of royal children was being born into the same lethal genetic trap, a royal nursery, where each baby arrived as a genetic lottery ticket carrying the Habsburg family curse closer to its ultimate monstrous conclusion. Margaret Theresa's tragic story wasn't an isolated blip in royal history. It was the canary in the coal mine for a genetic catastrophe quietly unfurling inside the gilded walls of the Spanish royal palace. Because back in Madrid, an entire generation of royal children was being born into the same lethal genetic trap, a living gallery of fragile princes and princesses who carried the invisible scars of centuries of royal incest. Inside those towering stone corridors, the Spanish court began to resemble something closer to a specialized hospital than a palace. Courtiers moved with hushed voices and worried glances as royal infants struggled to breathe, convulsed with seizures, or lay silently in cradles, their bodies too weak to even cry. Doctors documented every cough, every strange posture, every hint of deformity, but they spoke of these afflictions in riddles as mysterious royal illnesses rather than the consequences of cousin after cousin marrying in an endless loop. The Spanish infantas, the royal daughters, grew up beneath velvet drapes and golden chandeliers, trained from birth to carry themselves like porcelain dolls. But behind the royal etiquette and the carefully posed portraits lay a truth no artist could fully paint. Many suffered from fragile bones, difficulty swallowing, stunted growth, and learning disabilities that made even simple court duties a daunting task. For these children, life was a constant test of survival. Each year, the odds seemed to tilt further toward tragedy. Courtiers and wet nurses whispered behind tapestries about royal babies who didn't survive past infancy. Tiny coffins quietly carried through palace corridors at dawn so the public would never glimpse how fragile the royal bloodline had truly become. Each marriage within the family was supposed to strengthen the dynasty, but instead it was breeding a hidden monster, generation after generation. And there was no escaping it because the Habsburgs were trapped by their own obsession, the belief that their blood was too precious to mix with outsiders. The royal nursery became a genetic lottery. Would this child survive beyond a few months? Would they be able to walk, speak, bear children of their own to continue the dynasty? The stakes were impossibly high because every royal infant was both a hope for the future and a potential ticking time bomb. Portraits from this era revealed children posed stiffly, sometimes with expressions that seem vacant or strained. Artists like Velazquez painted the truth with subtle brushstrokes, a slight droop of the eyelid, a delicate hand resting at an odd angle, a lower lip protruding just a fraction too far. Even the glittering royal costumes couldn't disguise that something was deeply wrong beneath the silks and jewels. And while the Spanish court continued to project an image of power and divine right behind closed doors, the Habsburg dynasty was desperately battling an enemy more relentless than any rival king, their own DNA. Servants and attendants learned to navigate royal childhoods marked by sudden fevers, unexplained convulsions, and mysterious physical weaknesses. The royal calendar revolved not only around diplomatic ceremonies, but around medical crises that struck with terrifying unpredictability. And always, there was the unspoken fear that the next heir might be so severely affected that even the facade of royal power would crumble. Each birth was a gamble. Each funeral a silent warning that the dynasty was losing its battle against itself, and all those hidden tragedies, all those quiet medical secrets were building toward one final devastating result. Because as the 17th century marched forward, the Habsburg genetic curse was preparing to reveal itself in its most monstrous and public form. And the man who would bear the full weight of that centuries-long experiment gone wrong was already alive, already wearing a crown, and already struggling with the simple act of eating breakfast. His name was Charles II of Spain, and he would become the living proof that no empire, no matter how wealthy or powerful, can outwit the brutal mathematics of genetics. By the time Charles II took the throne, the Habsburg curse was no longer a whisper hidden in royal portraits or discreet court documents. It was screaming through every inch of the young king's body, turning him into the ultimate proof that no empire, no matter how vast, could escape the brutal arithmetic of genetics. Imagine a king crowned to rule an empire where the sun never set, stretching from the silver mines of Peru to the marble halls of Naples, from the bustling ports of the Netherlands to the spice routes of the Philippines. Yet every morning servants had to cut his food into bites small enough for a toddler because he couldn't chew solid bread. That was Charles II of Spain, the man who would become Europe's most tragic royal scandal and the viral embodiment of what happens when royal blood becomes poison. Charles was born in 1661, the child of an uncle-niece marriage so genetically entangled that modern scientists estimate his inbreeding coefficient was a staggering 0.254. That's higher than the genetic similarity between brother and sister. His entire existence was a monstrous experiment in royal incest made flesh. And the results were devastating. Charles II's lower jaw jutted forward so severely that his teeth couldn't meet. He couldn't chew properly. His tongue was too large for his mouth, garbling his speech until even foreign ambassadors struggled to understand the words of the man supposedly ruling half the known world. Court physicians described him suffering frequent convulsions, likely epileptic seizures, and a fragile immune system that made him vulnerable to every sickness circulating through the royal corridors. He learned to read painfully late around age 10 and never fully mastered even the basic subjects expected of a king. And perhaps most damning of all for a dynasty obsessed with bloodlines and heirs, Charles II was completely impotent. 2 desperate marriages were arranged to save the dynasty. First, Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess carefully chosen to bring fresh blood into the genetic pool. The court held its collective breath, praying that a single infusion of new DNA might reverse centuries of damage. But years passed. No pregnancies, no heir. The young queen withered under palace whispers, and the silent accusation that she had failed to produce a future king, when in truth the failure lay in the king's own shattered body. Marie-Louise died young, and the Habsburgs tried again, marrying Charles to Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess. Once more the Spanish court pinned its hopes on salvation through marriage, but the result was the same: no children, no future, and the dynasty's biological extinction loomed closer with every passing day. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters home describing scenes that sounded almost monstrous. A king whose mouth hung open, drool spilling from his lips, unable to sign documents because his hands trembled so violently. Some called him grotesque. Others simply pitied him, a man born into a golden cradle yet trapped inside a body betraying him at every turn. Charles knew what was happening. Court records suggest he understood that he was failing, not just as a king, but as the final link in a royal chain stretching back centuries. Imagine the weight of that knowledge pressing on a man already physically broken. The Spanish crown depended on his ability to produce an heir, but his own body made that impossible. And while Charles struggled to survive each day, the empire around him was beginning to fracture under the strain. Foreign powers watched like vultures circling a dying animal, ready to tear pieces from the once mighty Spanish Empire. But the full geopolitical consequences of Charles II's doomed reign and the war that would engulf Europe after his final breath would be a tragedy all its own. Because Charles's personal suffering was only the beginning. The collapse of an empire was about to follow. As Charles II dragged his broken body through the gilded corridors of the royal Alcazar, the true weight of the Habsburg Curse was no longer just a private tragedy, it was becoming a geopolitical earthquake ready to shatter Europe. Because a king who could barely swallow his breakfast was still on parchment, the ruler of an empire stretching from Manila to Madrid, from Naples to the New World. And the question haunting every royal court in Europe was chillingly simple: what happens when the king dies with no heir? For decades, the Spanish court tried to keep up appearances. Ministers whispered decisions into the king's ear, while foreign ambassadors strained to decipher his garbled speech and trembling hands. Behind the velvet curtains, power was already slipping away. Charles's inability to produce a child wasn't just a personal sorrow, it was a ticking time bomb threatening to ignite a continent-wide war. France, ruled by the ambitious Louis XIV, smelled blood in the water. The Sun King dreamed of placing his grandson on the Spanish throne, merging 2 colossal empires into a single dynasty that would dominate Europe. England and the Dutch Republic, terrified of French hegemony, prepared to resist any expansion of Bourbon power. Austria, the surviving Habsburg branch, believed the Spanish crown rightfully belonged to them. The entire continent was bracing for impact. Meanwhile, within Spain, the empire was visibly unraveling. French armies pressed the borders. English pirates preyed on Spanish treasure fleets. Dutch forces captured territories once loyal to Madrid. The Spanish treasury bled silver, drained by endless wars and royal extravagance. And all the while, Charles II sat at the center of this storm, a hollow-eyed monarch drooling into silk napkins, unable to speak clearly enough to issue orders, yet holding the fate of nations in his trembling hands. Foreign diplomats wrote letters back home describing scenes bordering on the grotesque. One ambassador claimed the king's face resembled a gargoyle. Another reported audiences where Charles stared blankly, unable to recognize familiar courtiers, his mind clouded by years of seizures and relentless physical decline. And as Charles's health deteriorated further, the Spanish court fractured into rival factions, each scheming to place their chosen candidate on the throne. Poison rumors spread like wildfire. Did French agents slip toxins into the royal food? Did Austrian loyalists plot to hasten the king's death to secure the empire for the Habsburgs? Europe was becoming a chessboard soaked in blood, and every move revolved around one frail king whose own body was betraying him. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II finally died in the royal Alcazar. No children, no heirs, no future for the Spanish Habsburg line. And the morning after his last breath, Europe erupted into chaos. The War of the Spanish Succession exploded across the continent, a cataclysm of shifting alliances, siege warfare, and political betrayals that would drag on for 13 brutal years, claim hundreds of thousands of lives, and redraw the map of Europe forever. The Golden Empire that once spanned half the globe lay shattered, divided among rival powers who picked over the bones of the Habsburg legacy like vultures feasting on a carcass. Yet in the end, the real war hadn't been fought on battlefields. It had been waged silently inside royal bedrooms and family trees, in the relentless pairing of cousin with cousin, uncle with niece. Because the true assassin of the Habsburg dynasty wasn't France or England or Austria. It was their own DNA, keeping a ledger of every cousin marriage, every royal vow sworn at the altar until the debt finally came due. And to truly understand how this royal family destroyed itself from within, we have to leave the thrones and the battlefields and step into the microscopic world of genes, a hidden realm where the Habsburg Curse was writing its final damning verdict. The war that tore Europe apart after Charles II's death was fought with cannons and cavalry. But the true war that destroyed the Spanish Habsburgs had been raging silently for centuries inside the microscopic coils of DNA, a war invisible to the human eye, yet ruthless enough to wipe an empire from the map. Because the real assassin of the Habsburg dynasty wasn't France or England or rival kings. It was the family's own genetic code relentlessly keeping score of every cousin marriage, every uncle wedded to a niece, until the debt finally exploded in Charles II's fragile body. Here's the brutal science behind the Habsburg Curse and why it's become one of the most viral case studies in the history of genetics. In a normal, healthy population, even if someone carries a harmful recessive gene, a genetic glitch capable of causing disease, it usually stays hidden, harmless. That's because their partner's DNA often provides a healthy copy of the gene, masking the dangerous one. It's nature's insurance policy. But when cousins marry cousins over and over, generation after generation, that genetic safety net disappears. Instead of shuffling the genetic deck, the family keeps playing the same cards over and over until all the bad cards are stacked together. And in the Habsburgs' case, those bad cards were catastrophic. Scientists today call it inbreeding depression, a genetic spiral where harmful traits like deformities, mental illness, infertility, and weakened immune systems become increasingly common. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient, a number that measures how genetically similar your parents are, was 0.254. That's worse than if his parents had been brother and sister. It meant he inherited identical copies of damaging genes from both sides of his family tree. And those genes didn't just affect his jaw. They sabotaged everything: his brain development, his immune system, even his ability to produce an heir. The infamous Habsburg jaw, the protruding lower jaw that started subtly in earlier generations, wasn't merely a quirky royal feature. It was a red flag screaming that the family's DNA was mutating. Each cousin marriage compounded the damage like compound interest in a financial account, except the only payoff was biological disaster. That's why by the time Charles II sat drooling at the royal table, he wasn't simply a sick king. He was the final product of a centuries-long experiment in genetic isolation. And the consequences didn't end with him. The War of Spanish Succession, which erupted the moment Charles died, childless, dragged on for 13 years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives, all because one royal family refused to let new blood into their gene pool. But the Habsburg story didn't just shape royal history, it reshaped science. Modern geneticists still study the Habsburg family tree as one of the most perfect, tragic natural experiments ever recorded. Every marriage contract, every royal birth, every painting by Velazquez became a piece of forensic evidence documenting how inbreeding wrecks human biology. Today's genetic counselors use lessons learned from the Habsburgs to warn families about the risks of marrying close relatives, and modern royal families, now fully aware of the biological minefield their ancestors stumbled through, make deliberate choices to marry outside their immediate circles, preventing a replay of the Habsburg disaster. Yet the true power of the Habsburg Curse goes far beyond palace walls. It's a viral blueprint for how human choices driven by power, pride, and politics can clash violently with biology. And it proves one unbreakable rule: DNA always keeps score. And as the echoes of the Habsburg Curse still ripple through history and science, one question remains: how far would you go to protect your family's power, even if it meant destroying your bloodline from within? Because in the end, the Habsburgs chose power over survival, and the world paid the price. But what's even more fascinating is how this royal tragedy quietly changed the way modern monarchies and all of us think about love, marriage, and the survival of our future generations. The Habsburg Curse didn't just end with the death of Charles II or the cannons of the War of Spanish Succession. Its shadows still stretch across royal families today, echoing in palaces from Madrid to Vienna, because the tragic experiment the Habsburgs carried out over 300 years didn't just change European history. It left behind a viral blueprint that modern science, medicine, and even modern monarchies continue to study, analyze, and quietly fear. After the genetic wreckage left in the wake of Charles II, royal houses across Europe began rethinking the ancient strategy of keeping bloodlines pure. The practice of uncle-niece marriages, once considered the gold standard of political alliances, started to decline. Courts that once boasted of royal blood as a divine gift now looked across borders for spouses trying to avoid repeating the catastrophic spiral that destroyed the Spanish Habsburgs. Though political marriages still existed, there was a growing awareness, even if no one yet understood genes, that too much pure blood was a dangerous illusion. The science wouldn't come for another century and a half, but the lesson was already sinking in. Monarchies began choosing alliances that didn't just strengthen crowns, but also protected the health of future heirs. And ironically, it was the Habsburg tragedy that provided modern scientists with the ultimate natural experiment. Geneticists pore over royal birth records, portraits, marriage contracts, and the hidden medical archives of centuries past, using the Habsburg family tree as a living textbook on how inbreeding depression devastates human biology. The royal jaws painted by Velazquez have become a warning sign recognized around the world, a symbol of what happens when power is placed above biology. Today's genetic counseling, prenatal screenings, and public health policies all carry echoes of the Habsburg lesson. Because when scientists advise families about hereditary risks or the dangers of marrying close relatives, they are in part speaking from a history written in royal blood, and the ripple effects reach far beyond palaces. The Habsburg Curse stands as a viral reminder to humanity that wealth, armies, and titles mean nothing if the blueprint of life itself, the DNA spiraling in every cell, begins to fail. It's a sobering truth that transcends centuries. You cannot negotiate with your genes. Power cannot outwit biology. And the price of ignoring genetic diversity is measured not just in lost dynasties, but in human suffering, physical deformity, and the quiet tragedy of lives never fully lived. The modern royal families of Europe have quietly embraced this lesson. Marriages now cross borders, religions, and even social classes in ways unthinkable during the Habsburg era. Kings and queens now look beyond mere dynastic strategy, conscious that healthy bloodlines are a matter of survival, not just political prestige. The blue blood that once commanded armies and shaped continents now flows alongside new genetic wisdom. Yet, the story of the Habsburgs refuses to fade. It remains a viral obsession for historians, geneticists, and millions of viewers fascinated by royal secrets. Because it's more than history, it's a dark fairy tale that reveals how ambition and love, power and pride can conspire to create monstrous consequences. The Habsburg Curse isn't just the tale of a family. It's a warning etched into the genetic code of humanity itself. And maybe the most chilling part of all is that the same forces pride, fear, the hunger to keep power contained within a chosen few still exist in human societies today. So the next time we look at a royal wedding broadcast across the world, the glittering jewels, the endless titles, and the promises of a perfect future, remember this: the price of pure blood can be the destruction of everything you're trying to protect. Because no matter how powerful your family, how vast your empire, or how golden your crown, DNA always keeps score. So, if there's one brutal truth that echoes through the marble corridors of history and into our own lives, it's this: no matter how high you rise, no matter how many crowns sit upon your family's heads, DNA always keeps score. The Habsburgs believed they could bend biology to their will, that royal blood could stay pure forever. Instead, they built a genetic time bomb that shattered an empire and turned kings into shadows of men. And here's why this story matters to every single one of us watching right now. Because the same forces that destroyed the Habsburgs' pride, fear of outsiders, the obsession with preserving power, still exist in the world today. In politics, in families, in how we choose who belongs and who doesn't. The lesson is clear: strength comes from diversity, not from building walls around our blood, our beliefs, or our hearts. The Habsburg Curse is more than a royal scandal. It's a warning written in human genes that reminds us we're all connected, and that the cost of ignoring that connection can be devastating. If this story shook you, or made you look at royal history with new eyes, drop a comment below. Tell me what surprised you the most, or which royal secrets you want uncovered next. Save this video so you can share the warning and the lesson with someone else. And if you crave more hidden histories and untold truths that prove how power, politics, and biology collide in ways more dramatic than any fiction, hit that subscribe button right now. Because here we don't just tell stories, we reveal the secrets that history tried to bury. And trust me, there's so much more waiting in the shadows.